learned and ideas. We go to market primarily in collaborating with managed service providers. So a managed service provider will sell our platform to their customers or pay for our platform and deliver it to their customers to do monitoring and security protection for small and mid-sized companies. And if any of you have worked with managed service providers, it's a really tough world out there for them right now. A lot of news reports that we've seen publicly around ransomware and other attacks, but they're just getting hammered, and there's this crisis of confidence going on in that world. So we're not going to just do slideware on here. We're going to really talk about the sausage behind how we made this report and some of our thoughts again. And we'd like this to be as interactive as you guys want it to be. So if you want to call us out on something on a slide or have a question about one of these graphics or something, feel free to do so. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing, because I think that context is important. We're basically looking at what it takes to build a SOC and a Tier 1 analyst, and how do you automate that from a SaaS perspective. So we're collecting data from our customers. We call them sensors. And it can be syslog, it can be NetFlow, it can be S3 logs dumped in an S3 bucket that we then pull out using a Lambda function. So there are lots of ways to get us data. We do some analysis on that, basically threat intelligence integration, predictive analytics, in kind of a way that's similar to reputation. We're not really trying to do behavioral signature-based detection on traffic. What we're looking at is how do you do 80% of the threat and stop and block these things that are commonplace hitting all these small and mid-sized companies. And then we allow some sort of action to be taken. We think about the world in terms of threat, not risk or vulnerability. So when we say threat, we're saying the likelihood that this IP address or domain is doing something bad, balanced with our trust and confidence in the reporting sources we've seen it from, balanced with the likelihood that it could be doing something good. So those sorts of attributes get all automated, no human in the loop, to come up with is it low, neutral, or high risk, and how confident are we in that assessment? And the whole goal for us from a customer perspective is enabling somebody that doesn't even know how to spell cybersecurity to kind of adjust a slider to manage their risk in some form or fashion. But it's an important distinction to say that 9 that I'm saying is high threat could actually be causing no risk to your network because it's getting blocked. And that's okay for me. We're focused on the threat aspect. And the final piece here is it's about how do you do this at scale. So we are glossing over, some of you that run SOCs or work in SOCs, we're glossing over a lot of that work because we're thinking about how do you do this for small and mid-sized companies at scale without having insight into the individual business operations of a given customer. So the data set that we looked at was basically, if I could look at NetFlow plus some other data across a collection of a relatively large sample size of managed service providers globally, what could I learn from that data set? And I like doing reports and analysis where you don't have a conclusion. Like a lot of reports I see in industry, somebody's like, I want to do a report on how bad phishing is, and I want to, so you assume the conclusion of that report. From our perspective, it's let's collect a bunch of data and figure out what we can learn from it. So as I said, it's NetFlow plus, IPs, ports, protocols, data volume, firewall log data, basically. We enrich it with all the traditional stuff, whois, ASNs. We have some SSH fingerprinting and nmapping work that we're doing to kind of profile those hosts. And then we also compared this data set of managed service provider firewalls against all of our other customer firewalls. So we have managed service providers that are protecting other customers. So to say, is it interesting if this group of IPs only show up on managed service provider firewalls and not everybody else? Could we find conclusions as a result? We use Postgres, Tableau, Gephi. I love Gephi for visualizations. It's pretty cool and easy to use. And a lot of Python scripting. And again, if you've ever done a report like this or thought about doing a report, one lesson learned out of doing this in the past is you have to version control your data set. So we built one very, very large materialized view of all the data, and then we lock that down because you want to be able to reproduce your findings later. There's nothing worse than writing a bunch of SQL queries and coming up with some cool data, and then next week you're like, how did I do that, right? And so you have to be able to reproduce your results in your data. And kind of the final background slide. This is kind of a view of some of the tables we use. This big table in the middle is that materialized view of kind of what we were working with. You'll see we announced publicly a partnership with Gray Noise, so those folks that don't know Andrew and what he's doing, we use their value data or their data pretty heavily as part of this. You'll see that there. Tying into fingerprints, You may think there's kind of a one-to-one relationship of SSH fingerprints. We trigger a fingerprint when an Nmap scan comes back with SSH as a description on a port. And so like on one server, we had 50 different SSH ports open, which is kind of cool to see. Like some dev company in the Netherlands basically had 20 different versions of SSH running on a server. Interesting. So there are some assumptions you make about the data set that you scrape into, and you're like, I don't know if that's interesting or not, but it's different. And then on the left-hand side, we actually have kind of the detailed volume of every source to destination, how much data was transferred over every individual port, and they'd be able to kind of profile that over time. Any questions on kind of the background data set? Getting that out of the way? Cool. So again, the goal here is not to summarize the whole report, but walk you through some of these key findings. John and I will kind of go back and forth in this section. Here you go.
Okay. That's really loud. Hopefully I don't get too much feedback on this. Yeah, as Vince mentioned, we just kind of dove into the data to try and see what we could find. And one thing that really stood out really quickly was the presence of the Mirai botnet in the data set. And so we pulled some of this stuff together in Gephi. The one that is on the left here that kind of looks like NASA checking out sunspots is the presence within the entire data set. You can see the little white dots in the center of the nodes, the individual MSP networks that these IPs are interacting with. And the vortex that you kind of see in the top left there, if we extrapolate it, looks like the graph there on the right, which is just a single MSP network where roughly 20,000 IPs associated with the Mirai botnet were just hammering their firewall over and over again. Ended up resolving to roughly 150 countries and 3,600 organizations, the top two being Changhua Telecom in Taiwan and China Unicom. And being able to see a well-known set of threat actors and their presence in a well-distributed set of data was just really interesting, and in particular that one network that's just getting slammed with it. Another thing that became very apparent very quickly was the presence of DigitalOcean servers interacting with this data set. The one on the left is the entire DigitalOcean set, the individual nodes on the outside, the networks interacting with those endpoints, but then the one on the right where they're colored red, those are ones that we saw exhibiting or associated with some malicious activity. And so it worked out to be just under a third, which is not at all insignificant. So when looking at this, it kind of begs the question, or rather a couple of questions of, with this huge push towards cloud infrastructure, what responsibility, what obligation does someone like DigitalOcean have to its users and the wider community when it comes to these actors that are using their infrastructure for bad things? And not that we're on the philosophy track, but to get philosophical for a second, what's the morality behind a company like DigitalOcean profiting from that kind of activity? And Vince and I have seen some examples before of, not to get too tangential, of DigitalOcean servers spinning up, executing an attack, and then in a matter of hours standing back down and before any sort of traditional detection methods can pick up on it. And so I think someone mentioned yesterday that the average time for an analyst to determine if something's good or bad is like 6 minutes, I think it was. So when you're dealing with something like that just really has no fingerprint, how do you deal with that? And then how does DigitalOcean come in on that? So I don't know if you had anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think 31% of the DigitalOcean hosts observed in this data set were doing something bad. And these are not benign scanners. Like, we ran everything by gray noise, and they categorized things as unknown, benign, or malicious. So these are not benign scanners. These are things they've tagged as malicious scanners as well. And I guarantee the results would have been very similar if we looked at things like OVH and SAS and all these other hosting environments, which from a defender perspective, this creates a lot of challenge, as John hit.
And so then another data set within this data set that we saw as kind of being problematic, and there's obviously a lot of discussions in the community about this, is some of those benign scanning organizations, think Shodan, Census, Net Systems Research. We were seeing that if you're looking at, with the exception of the bottom right quadrant there, that 75% of these organizations are hitting at least 50% of these MSP networks, with Arbor Observatory and Shadow Server in particular hitting over almost 2/3 of those. And when you're thinking about the magnitude of the scanning that they're doing and how, to an analyst, scanning is scanning, you can't necessarily immediately tell good scanning from bad scanning, how very quickly those analysts at those MSPs are going to get overloaded by that. There's also the issue of, the research that they're doing. We think it's great that you can, run through Shodan's API and be able to see if there are any vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. But of course, that's also accessible to anyone else too. So being able to see how prevalent this is in this community is interesting. But the implications of it on their analysts is troubling. And so, like I said, scanning is scanning. So a lot of times we see that these benign scanners will start showing up on threat intelligence feeds. We even have some examples of some Shodan and BitSite IPs that are showing up on 8, 9, 10 different threat lists. And so if you're using these threat feeds and these things are showing up, you're I don't know, how do you want to say this? It gets difficult to kind of pick the good from the bad when you're flagging everything the same way.
Yeah, we love these tools like Census and these other tools. There's a lot of value to them, right? To be able to say, I want to look at any host and what you know about it. And it's obvious that the only way you get that information is by scanning these hosts. I thought what was cool is like the number of MSPs that we looked at, and they're kind of unrelated. They're all over the globe. The fact that 2/3 of these were hit during that time period by a lot of these scanners means they're hitting very, very large portions of the internet in any given period of time, right? These are massive scanning activities. And the overlap of, again, there's a tweet from Andrew, if you guys follow him on Twitter, and he said, I love looking at threat intelligence feeds and throwing the IPs in and seeing how many of them are benign scanners. But this overlap for unsophisticated security operations centers where you say, I'm going to rely on the firehole list or these other lists that are good for identifying threats, and you have what looks like an attack from something that is on all these lists, and it's Shodan, right? And so you just spin your wheels kind of trying to run these things down. And so, for us, it also brings in there's this discussion around orchestration and automation around, how do you kind of detect these things and move them off to the side easier, which if you're a large SOC, you can manage those processes. If you're a small team, you're screwed, right? It's tough.
Yeah, and one just kind of tidbit there is that we're looking exclusively at the MSP networks in this. We're not even looking at their customers. So if you're an MSP analyst and you have enough of your own problems to deal with, how you're even going to get down to your customers' problems. And so we kind of profiled some of these benign scanners, and looking at it's really cool to see how, while they're all kind of doing a lot of the same things, their modalities and their patterns and their scanning are very distinctly different. So you can see the Stretchoid just kind of like fires a laser beam at you and never stops. Project Sonar, Net Systems, they're kind of hitting you with Morse code, and then Bingbot's just kind of crazy all over the place. And so those kind of random patterns, looking at this from an analyst perspective, is really easy to see how quickly you could get overloaded by this. And this isn't even looking at any of the malicious scanning.
Yeah, you see people that are very judiciously kind of picking systems to scan, and some people that are just like blanketing it. Does anybody know what the Stretchoid stuff is? Does anybody? It showed up for me like the first time like 2 years ago, and I couldn't find anything about it, and I've added some post to like OTX, but there is just no rate limiting on that sucker. It's just crazy.
Yeah,
I know.
It's
all right,
too much. So I think you wanted to chat about this real quick.
How many have like tried to write a report for public release before? A show of hands. Like one of the problems is like, how do you take interesting findings to geeks and technical folks and boil it down to something useful for the general public? Right. The final report that we have, including cover pages and some other stuff, is like 18 pages. There's like a 2-page executive summary and then like 1 or 2 pages on each of these topics. And some of the feedback from the MSPs that we've released this to early is like, it's too long, it's too detailed. It's like, well, I looked at 1 million endpoints across 90 days across all these networks. There's a ton of data. Like 18 pages, well, really it's like 12 pages of content if you really boil it down. That's too long. But one of the things we really spent a lot of time trying to cross-section the data and try to find interesting results was, like, there's got to be something cool around ports and protocols and data. And the thing we settled on was this RDP scanning. Like, we know MSPs are getting nailed with RDP and RMM vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And so could we pull out something interesting when we look at 3389 traffic across these MSPs? And what was cool is, like, if you take a 3D visualization, which is what that is, I was just tired of, we were tired of having Gephi charts and bar charts, so we had to come up with a different visualization, which is where the 3D visualization comes in. But the idea here was there were legitimate spikes in activity when an MSP would use RDP for a business function. And these lines here are lined by our scores. So the green are the low scores, yellow or neutral. And you'll see periodic spikes when activity happened. And then there's this gulf in the stuff in the 6 7 and 8, which is kind of high threat, low confidence, and neutral trending bad, are pretty small. And so what was cool for me is I expected a big distribution of even stuff across all those categories at the higher level, but it was like not a whole lot happening. And then at the 9, which is high threat, high confidence, there was this constant, steady stream of scanning. And so kind of the lesson learned we try to pull out of that is this idea that, I expected it to be harder to see malicious RDP scanning than it actually was. Like a lot of the threat intelligence out there identifies this, it's happening in bulk, so your ability to kind of integrate those sources and automatically block it probably will have a better effect than not, because there's not a lot of like random scanning for that or those spikes. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. We tried to pull out something different looking at RDP stuff.
Yeah, and so when we turn it back to looking at the entire data set and kind of some of those known scanners, I think we had something like 60 or 70,000 that we identified as potential scanning activities. Yeah. This is looking at, so x-axis is time, y-axis is ports going from low to high, and each individual color represents an IP address. So you can see that there's an obvious concentration below port 10,000, but then you see these other distinctly almost targeted, concentrated pockets of certain port ranges, certain time periods, and then you have these other guys that are just kind of blasting through it. So again, looking at this from an analyst perspective, I can see some points where I would probably start looking at first, but then once I get beyond those, I start getting lost really, really quickly. And so, as Vince mentioned, we're using some of Gray Noise's data, so to be able to lay that over it as a filter and weed out those broadly targeted scanners that are looking at everyone and not anyone in particular, we can really get a picture of, okay, for my network, what do I really need to be concerned with? So very quickly, the green line, the gray line, and the red lines there show me that there are these guys that are scanning every single one of my ports over a distinct period of time, and they're not showing up within Gray Noise, so it's likely targeting me. And so I think we determined that gray one there was a DigitalOcean server, going back to DigitalOcean for a second, hosted in the Netherlands that just showed up on one network, hitting every port for about a 7-day period. But with the Gray Noise data, we can say, going back to this here real quick, for everything that does not show up in this view, I can just push that to my firewall, block it, and move on. Still block these, but then dig into them a little bit deeper to say, okay, why is this gray line here particularly interested in my network? Is there something I need to be aware of to better address security-wise? And so being able to look at this was just really cool. And I'm sure there's probably more we could look at, but we just very quickly got really deep into it. So
to hit that from a little, just to re-emphasize that, like this shows all the scanning, and then this is all the scanning activity with benign and malicious scanners removed. Because one of the things that I love about the Gray Noise data set is if there's a malicious scanner that's hitting everybody, I'm not as worried about it as I am. That green line is an interesting one. It's like somebody ran a scan against me, and according to Gray Noise, they've never seen it scan anybody else, right? So what does that mean, right? And so targeted, of course, right? And so the ability to say, I can't do anything with all this noise, but I can now figure out how to prioritize my actions here is really cool to see. And it's cool visually to see this across a bunch of networks with a bunch of noise. Like the visualizations work better with the more data. I'm not going to run through the findings. I put the slide up here because you're always, when you write these reports, you always have to like come up with some key findings. And you always have to balance, like, I hate FUD, but you also, from a marketing perspective, you need to do some like emphasis. There's always like, well, what does that mean to me? And so as a lesson learned, like the idea is like kind of going through the exercise of like sharpening the point into 1 or 2 sentences about what's the message on certain facts of your analysis is a really good learning experience for anybody that's doing defensive or offensive stuff in cyber. Just forcing yourself to go through that focusing process is a valuable process. Some lessons learned here. Again, going through the motion of writing a report, it's painful, it sucks, it takes a lot of time and energy, but I really strongly believe everybody should do it. I think we, as a community, are lacking, and this is kind of skipping to the third bullet, but we're lacking a lot of original content. in the space. I've seen a lot of good content here at this, and I think it's awesome. But I think publicly, like a lot of these publicly launched reports I'm seeing are, I'm going to pay an organization to take a survey of a bunch of companies to make a point that I want to make from a marketing perspective and release it as a big, exciting report. Right, and how many more survey reports do we need to see of 77%, 66%, 55% because I want you to buy my phishing tool or whatever it is, right? But I think one of the reasons people don't do it more is it's scary. Like writing this report, having findings, and like putting yourself out to the world to say, maybe I made mistakes here, maybe we wrote something wrong, maybe we read the data differently. It's scary, but I've never. In the past, when we've done this, the feedback has always been great, and it's always good to see like the response to original new content coming out, because I do think it helps push things forward a little bit. Anything you want to add on lessons learned?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, and so what we came here with was what we're hoping to take away from it is that we have this data set that we would love to get other sets of eyes on with different modalities and data sets that you might have. So we're looking for data partners and other people who can use data like this to research and maybe find some things that we missed. One of the things that Vince had on his lessons learned is it's all too easy to get sucked down into the rabbit hole, so we had to keep pulling ourselves back out of things that we were finding that were just red herrings and led nowhere. But I'm sure with some other eyes on it, we could probably find some more interesting findings within this. We're certainly open to the good, bad, and ugly of the feedback that you can offer us, whether it's around the methods that we took or the way that we presented it. And if this is something that sparks your interest, certainly would not mind seeing it being shared a little bit. So I don't know if you had any closing thoughts or.
Yeah, so we're publicly releasing this at we publicly launched it at kind of noon Eastern, and we'll be kind of tweeting about it and sharing it. So if any of you would shameless plug here, sharing it within your group if you so feel free move to do so. Give us any feedback or comments. That's it. Questions? Anything you guys have?
You mentioned your work was primarily focused on MSPs. Roughly how many were in your kind of catchment?
So, we pride ourselves, and this is where it gets like, we don't talk about publicly, talk about customers or numbers. One of the things that's unique about what we're doing, and this is where the data sharing partnerships come in, is we have hopefully it's going to come through in the next couple of months, but we have a patent pending for like 3 or 4 years on this anonymization approach that we take. And so we do in real time as the data comes in anonymize it. And so like for folks like Gray Noise, we're able to share real-time data back anonymously. But we don't answer number of customers, number of MSPs. But it was a large sample. So enough tap dancing on that one.